In the dusty saloon of Tombstone Territory, what started as a poker game between whiskey-soaked cowboys turned into something far more sinister. When Jake Morrison's luck ran dry and his debts mounted higher than his horse could carry, he made a wager that would haunt the frontier forever. The stakes weren't gold or cattle. They were 8-year-old Sarah Mitchell, whose family had been massacred just days before. The cowboys laughed as they claimed their human prize, seeing nothing but property in the trembling child's eyes. But that same night, as the desert wind howled through their camp, a shadow moved with deadly precision. Running Bear, a lone Apache warrior, had been watching. What he did next would spark a conflict that neither the cowboys nor his own tribe saw coming. His rescue of the girl wasn't just an act of mercy, it was a declaration of war. But what made Running Bear risk everything for a white settler's child? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell clutched her torn doll against her chest, the fabric still stained with her mother's blood from 3 days past. The little girl's world had ended in screams and gunfire when Jake Morrison's gang had descended upon their homestead like vultures. Her father had tried to protect them, shotgun in hand, but 6 men against 1 had odds that even courage couldn't overcome. Now she sat in the corner of the Red Dog saloon, watching these same killers gamble away what remained of her family's possessions. The irony wasn't lost on the few sober patrons. Jake Morrison, the man who'd murdered her parents for their meager savings, was now betting her life because those same savings had already been drunk away. "I got nothing left but the girl," Morrison slurred, his bloodshot eyes darting between his cards and the growing pot. Whiskey had made him bold, but poker had made him desperate. The ranch he'd lost to his gambling debts 2 months ago seemed like a distant memory compared to tonight's stakes. "A little girl ain't worth much," sneered Buck Williams, spitting tobacco juice into a dented spittoon. "What's she gonna do, cook and clean? She ain't old enough for much else." Morrison's face darkened. "She's worth whatever you boys think she's worth. Hell, you can sell her to them traveling families headed west. They always need extra hands, and nobody's gonna ask questions about where she came from." The other cowboys exchanged glances. Tom Bradley, the youngest of the group at barely 20, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Even he understood the implications of what Morrison was suggesting. But the pot held more money than any of them had seen in months, and conscience was a luxury none of them could afford. "All right," said Red Murphy, the unofficial leader when Morrison was too drunk to make decisions. "But if you lose, she's ours to split however we see fit." Sarah pressed her face against her doll's matted hair, trying to disappear into the corner. She understood enough of their words to know her fate hung on painted cards and her father's killer's failing luck. The doll's button eyes stared back at her with the same blank expression her mother had worn in those final moments. Morrison dealt the cards with shaking hands. His addiction had started small, a few coins bet on faro, maybe a hand or two of poker after a successful cattle drive. But like a prairie fire, it had consumed everything in its path. First his ranch, then his horse, then his dignity. Now he was wagering the life of the child whose parents he'd murdered for money he'd already lost. The hand played out with agonizing slowness. Morrison held a pair of queens, decent cards that might have won against casual players. But these men had been gambling longer than they'd been outlaws, and Red Murphy's 3 10s sealed Sarah's fate as surely as bullets had sealed her parents'. "Well, I'll be damned," Morrison muttered, staring at his losing hand. "Guess she's yours now, boys." The cowboys turned to look at Sarah with the same calculating eyes her father might have used to appraise livestock. She was small for 8, malnourished from years of frontier hardship, but she was healthy and could work. In their twisted reasoning, she represented an investment rather than a human being. "Come here, girl," Red Murphy called, his voice carrying the authority of ownership. "You belong to us now. You'll do what we say, when we say it, and maybe we'll keep you fed." Sarah remained frozen in the corner, her arms wrapped tightly around her doll. The fabric smelled like home, like her mother's soap and her father's pipe tobacco. It was all she had left of the life these men had destroyed. Outside, the desert wind howled through Tombstone's empty streets, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. In the shadows beyond the saloon's flickering lamplight, dark eyes watched the scene unfold with growing fury. Running Bear had tracked Morrison's gang for 3 days, following the same trail that had led them to the Mitchell homestead. He had seen the aftermath of their butchery, the scattered belongings, the burned barn, the shallow graves hastily dug in the hard ground. But he hadn't expected to find the sole survivor reduced to gambling stakes in a frontier saloon. The Apache warrior's hand tightened around his father's knife handle as he watched civilized men behave like animals. In his culture, children were sacred, protected by the entire tribe regardless of blood relations. What he witnessed through the grimy window challenged everything he understood about honor and humanity. The Cowboys gathered around Sarah, their boots heavy on the wooden floor, as they approached their prize. Morrison had already forgotten her existence, calling for another bottle to drown his losses. The girl would be their problem now, their property to do with as they pleased. Running Bear melted back into the darkness, his mind already forming plans. The rescue would require patience, stealth, and perfect timing. But as he watched Sarah clutch her blood-stained doll, he knew that some things were worth any risk. Running Bear's fingers traced the eagle feather medicine pouch that hung from his neck, seeking guidance from the spirits of his ancestors. The sacred bundle had belonged to his grandfather, then his father, each man adding their own prayers and visions to its power. Tonight, as he crouched on the ridge overlooking the Cowboys' camp, he felt the weight of generations pressing upon his shoulders. The Apache warrior had not always walked between worlds with such pain. 10 summers ago, he had been Swift Arrow, a young brave eager to prove himself in raids against the Mexican settlements to the south. But that was before the bluecoats came in numbers like locusts, before his village was burned and his family scattered to the 4 winds. His wife, Morning Star, had died clutching their infant son while soldiers torched their home. The memory still visited him in dreams, her eyes wide with terror, not for herself, but for their child who would never learn to hunt or sing the old songs. The soldiers had called it a punitive expedition, retaliation for Apache raids that had grown too bold. Running Bear called it murder. Since that day, he had carried 2 names and 2 hearts. The whites knew him as a scout for the cavalry, a tamed Indian who could track outlaws and guide supply trains through hostile territory. To his own people, he remained Swift Arrow, though many questioned whether a man could serve his enemies without losing his soul. The contradiction tore at him like a wolf trap, but it also gave him advantages. He understood both worlds, could move through white settlements without suspicion while maintaining connections to Apache survivors scattered across the territory. This knowledge had led him to Morrison's gang and their trail of destruction. Now, watching Sarah huddle in the Cowboys' makeshift camp below, he saw his own son's face in her terror. The child was white, her people the enemies of his ancestors, but innocence recognized no boundaries of blood or tribe. She was alone in a hostile world, exactly as his son would have been if fate had reversed their positions. The medicine pouch grew warm against his chest as Running Bear studied the camp's layout. 4 men, including Morrison, who had already drunk himself into a stupor beside the dying fire. 2 others played cards by lamplight, while the 4th, a young cowboy who seemed uncomfortable with their human cargo, stood guard at the camp's perimeter. Sarah sat apart from the men, still clutching her doll with the fierce desperation of someone holding onto the last piece of a shattered world. Even from this distance, Running Bear could see her shoulders shake with silent sobs. She was trying not to make noise, instinctively understanding that drawing attention might bring worse treatment. The Apache warrior had faced Mexican bandits, cavalry charges, and territorial marshals, but planning the rescue of one small girl presented unique challenges. Violence would be easy, a knife in the darkness, bodies left for the buzzards. But Sarah had already witnessed enough death. She needed salvation, not more bloodshed. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper from the medicine pouch, reminding him of the old teachings. A true warrior protects the innocent, especially those who cannot protect themselves. The spirits did not distinguish between Apache children and white children when judging the worth of a rescue. But this decision would have consequences beyond tonight's action. Stealing a white child from white men would be seen as an act of war, justification for the kind of retaliation that had already destroyed too many Apache communities. His own people might reject him for bringing such danger upon them. Running Bear touched the eagle feather again, remembering his father's words about the bird's medicine. Eagles soared above tribal boundaries and territorial disputes, seeing the whole world as their domain. They protected all creatures in their territory, not just those that shared their nest. The young guard was growing drowsy, his rifle drooping as he fought off sleep. The card players were arguing over a disputed hand, their voices carrying clearly in the still air. Morrison had begun snoring, empty bottle clutched against his chest like a lover. The time for planning was ending. Running Bear checked his weapons. The silver-bladed knife his father had carried in raids against the Spanish. A war club that had belonged to his grandfather. And the silence that was an Apache warrior's greatest weapon. He would need all three before dawn. Sarah deserved better than to die slowly in the hands of men who saw her as property. If Running Bear's actions brought war upon his people, at least one innocent soul would be saved. The medicine pouch seemed to pulse with approval as he began his descent toward the sleeping camp. Some choices transcended tribal loyalty and personal safety. Tonight, he would discover if his grandfather's medicine was strong enough to protect them both. Running Bear drew his father's silver-bladed knife from its beaded sheath, the metal gleaming dully in the starlight. The weapon had tasted blood in raids against Spanish settlements, Mexican banditos, and rival tribes. But tonight it would serve a different purpose. Tonight it would cut bonds rather than throats, free the innocent rather than claim the guilty. The blade had been forged by a Mexican silversmith, captured during his grandfather's youth, hammered from silver coins stolen from a Spanish mission. Each generation of his family had added their own medicine to the steel. Eagle feathers bound to the handle, turquoise inlaid in the grip, prayers whispered over the metal during sacred ceremonies. It was more than a weapon. It was a legacy of resistance carved in silver and steel. The young guard's head finally dropped as sleep overtook vigilance. Running Bear moved like smoke across the desert floor, his moccasined feet finding purchase on stone and sand without disturbing so much as a pebble. 40 years of hunting deer and elk in mountain forests had taught him patience. 20 years of war had taught him silence. Sarah saw him before the Cowboys did. Her eyes widened as the shadow materialized from the darkness, but some instinct kept her from crying out. Perhaps children recognize protectors more easily than adults, or perhaps her terror had sharpened her senses beyond normal limits. She watched the Apache warrior approach with the stillness of a cornered rabbit evaluating a potential savior. The guard never woke as Running Bear's arm encircled his throat, applying pressure to the blood vessels rather than the windpipe. The technique left the man unconscious but breathing, a mercy that Apache raiders rarely showed white enemies. But this was not a raid. This was a rescue that required precision rather than vengeance. The card players remained absorbed in their dispute over a questionable ace, their voices masking any small sounds from the camp's perimeter. Morrison's drunken snores continued unabated, the empty bottle rising and falling on his chest like a glass heartbeat. The timing was perfect, but Running Bear knew that perfect timing lasted only moments in operations like this. Sarah's bonds parted under the silver blade's edge with barely a whisper. The rope had chafed her wrists raw, leaving marks that spoke of the cowboy's callous disregard for her comfort. She rubbed circulation back into her hands while Running Bear checked the positions of the remaining guards. "Can you ride?" he whispered in English, his accent thick but understandable. Sarah nodded, though her experience was limited to the gentle farm horses her father had kept for ploughing. These men's mounts were range animals, harder and less predictable than the patient workhorses she remembered. Running Bear's own horse waited in a wash 30 yards from the camp, trained through years of warfare to remain silent and still until called. The Apache warrior had learned to choose his mounts carefully, animals that could navigate rough terrain in darkness, survive on little water, and respond to subtle commands that wouldn't alert enemies. The escape began as smoothly as the approach had proceeded. Sarah moved with surprising quiet for a frightened child, perhaps understanding that noise meant death, or worse. They reached the horse without incident, Running Bear lifting her easily onto the animal's back before swinging up behind her. That's when Buck Williams chose to step away from the card game to relieve himself. "What the hell?" Williams shouted as he spotted the mounted figures. His voice shattered the night's silence like gunfire, bringing the entire camp to instant alertness. Running Bear's heels drove into his horse's flanks as bullets began whining through the air around them. The animal leaped forward with the explosive power of a mountain cat, covering ground in bounds that jarred Sarah against the warrior's chest. She wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the silver knife's handle press against her ribs. Morrison stumbled to his feet, whiskey and rage making his movements clumsy, but his aim surprisingly accurate. A bullet parted Running Bear's hair. As they crested the first rise, another sang off rocks to their left. The Cowboys were grabbing saddles and bridles, preparing pursuit that would begin within minutes. The chase led through terrain that Running Bear had scouted during his 3-day surveillance. He knew every wash, every rock formation, every stand of desert oak that might provide concealment. His horse picked its way through obstacles that would slow heavier animals, using Apache knowledge of the desert's hidden paths. Sarah pressed her face against his back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing despite the desperate pace. The silver knife bumped against her side with each stride, a tangible reminder that she had traded one form of captivity for an uncertain freedom. But the arms that held her steady conveyed protection rather than ownership, strength guided by purpose rather than cruelty. Behind them, the Cowboys' curses echoed off canyon walls as they struggled to follow tracks invisible in the darkness. Morrison's rage drove him forward despite his whiskey-clouded judgment, fury overriding caution as he whipped his horse through dangerous terrain. Running Bear's mount began to tire as they climbed toward higher ground, but the Apache warrior knew these mountains intimately. Hidden springs, sheltered caves, and secret paths learned in childhood would provide advantages that pursuit could not overcome. The silver blade had cut more than rope tonight. It had severed the chain of cruelty that bound Sarah to her captors, beginning a journey that would test both rescuer and rescued in ways neither could imagine. By dawn, Jake Morrison's crude sketch of Running Bear's face stared back from hastily drawn wanted posters nailed to every hitching post in Tombstone. The drawing captured little beyond basic features: high cheekbones, long dark hair, the traditional war paint that Morrison insisted he'd seen in the moonlight. But the crude artwork served its purpose, transforming a rescue into a manhunt and a protector into prey. $500 for the Apache who stole our property, Morrison announced to the gathering crowd of prospectors, gamblers, and drifters drawn by the promise of easy money. His hands still shook from the previous night's whiskey, but rage had burned away most of the alcohol's effects. Dead or alive, makes no difference to me. The wanted poster's rough sketching bore little resemblance to Running Bear's actual features, but frontier justice rarely concerned itself with accuracy. Any Apache warrior found in the territory might satisfy Morrison's thirst for vengeance, a reality that placed every native man within 100 miles in mortal danger. Meanwhile, in a hidden canyon 15 miles east of Tombstone, Running Bear studied Sarah's pale face as she slept fitfully against a boulder. The child had barely spoken during their night-long flight, responding to his questions with nods or shakes of her head. Exhaustion had finally claimed her just before sunrise. her small body curled around the torn doll that remained her only link to her murdered family. The canyon offered temporary sanctuary, with walls too steep for horses and only one narrow entrance that Running Bear could defend if necessary. A small spring provided fresh water, and scattered pines offered shade from the desert sun that was already beginning to bake the rocks around them. But he knew their pursuers would expand their search pattern systematically, eventually discovering even carefully hidden refugees. Running Bear's horse stood with lowered head, flanks still heaving from the previous night's desperate run. The animal had given everything to ensure their escape, but it would need rest and grain to continue much farther. Apache ponies were hardy, bred for endurance over generations of warfare, but they were not invincible. Sarah stirred as the sun crested the canyon's eastern rim, blinking in confusion before memory returned with crushing weight. She sat up quickly, scanning their surroundings with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that safety was always temporary.
"Where are we?"
she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying and dust. "Safe place," Running Bear replied, though he knew safety was relative in their situation.
"You hungry?"
Sarah nodded, though hunger warred with nausea in her stomach. She had eaten nothing since the previous morning, but the events of the past day had left her system rebelling against the thought of food. Running Bear produced jerky and pine nuts from his saddlebags, traditional trail food that could sustain Apache warriors for days. He offered the provisions with gentle patience, understanding that trust would take time to build. The child had every reason to fear men after what she had endured. "My name Running Bear," he said as she nibbled tentatively at the dried meat. "What they call you?"
"Sarah,"
she whispered. Sarah Mitchell. The name hung between them like a bridge across cultural divides. Running Bear had known white families with that surname, settlers who had treated Apache traders fairly and with respect. Perhaps this child came from better stock than the animals who had claimed her as property. "Sarah is good name," Running Bear said. "Mean princess in white man's tongue?" A ghost of a smile flickered across Sarah's face, the first expression of anything but terror he had seen from her. Her father had told her the same thing on her last birthday, explaining that she was named for a biblical queen who had been beautiful and wise. The sound of distant hoofbeats echoing off canyon walls cut their moment of connection short. Running Bear moved swiftly to the canyon's entrance, peering through a crack in the rocks that allowed observation without exposure. 3 riders picked their way carefully along the wash below, studying tracks that the previous night's wind had mostly erased. Buck Williams led the search party, his experience as a tracker making him the logical choice to follow Running Bear's trail. Behind him rode Tom Bradley, the youngest of Morrison's gang, and a grizzled prospector named Cactus Pete, who had been recruited with promises of easy money. "Trail goes cold here," Williams announced, dismounting to examine the ground more closely. "That Apache's too smart to leave sign in this rocky country." Running Bear watched the searchers with professional interest. Williams was competent but not exceptional, following obvious signs while missing subtle indicators that would have led a truly skilled tracker to the canyon's entrance. The prospector was clearly out of his depth, more comfortable with mining claims than manhunts. Sarah pressed close to Running Bear's side, her breathing quick and shallow as she fought panic. The child understood that these men represented a return to captivity, or worse. Her small hand found his arm, seeking reassurance from the only person who had shown her kindness since her parents' murder. "They no find us," Running Bear murmured. "Canyon has Apache medicine. Spirits protect innocent ones." The searchers spent another hour examining the area before admitting defeat. Williams remounted with obvious frustration, knowing that Morrison would not accept failure gracefully. The gang leader's rage had been building since the previous night's humiliation, fed by wounded pride and the jeers of other outlaws who found humor in his loss. "We'll try the northern approaches," Williams decided. "That Apache's got to be heading for his people's territory." Running Bear smiled grimly at the misdirection. His own people were scattered, some on reservations, others hiding in remote mountain strongholds. But the searcher's assumptions would work in his favor, sending them away from his actual destination. As the hoofbeats faded, Sarah looked up at her protector with eyes that held the beginning of trust. She didn't understand Apache beliefs about spirits and medicine, but she recognized strength and determination when she saw them. This man had risked everything to save her life, and she was beginning to believe he might actually succeed. The wanted poster might have set a price on Running Bear's head, but it had also marked the beginning of a bond that would transcend cultural boundaries and challenge everyone's assumptions about loyalty, family, and the meaning of home. Sarah's fingers traced the rough wooden cross her father had carved for her 7th birthday, the grain worn smooth by months of desperate clutching. The simple religious symbol had survived the massacre, the poker game, and now the harrowing escape, somehow remaining tucked deep in her dress pocket through every ordeal. As Running Bear led their horse carefully down a steep mountain trail, she found comfort in the familiar texture of the carved wood. The cross represented everything her family had believed about faith, forgiveness, and the promise of salvation in a harsh world. But now, riding behind an Apache warrior deeper into territory her people considered hostile, Sarah wondered if her father's God watched over children who found safety with their supposed enemies. "We stop soon," Running Bear said over his shoulder, noting how the child swayed with exhaustion despite her efforts to remain alert. "Safe place ahead? My people wait." Sarah's grip tightened on the cross as uncertainty flooded through her. The stories she'd heard about Apache camps filled her mind with images of scalps and torture, tales told around frontier hearths to frighten children into obedience. But the man who held her steady on the horse had shown nothing but gentleness since their escape. Running Bear guided his mount through a narrow pass between towering red rocks, following a trail invisible to untrained eyes. The path had been used by his people for generations, worn smooth by countless hunting parties and war bands seeking passage through the mountains. Now it would serve as a bridge between two worlds for a frightened white child. The Apache camp materialized gradually, hidden among pines and boulders with such skill that Sarah barely recognized the scattered wickiups until they were nearly among them. Women looked up from their work with curious eyes, children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, and warriors reached casually for weapons while maintaining expressions of studied calm. "Running Bear returns," called an elderly woman whose weathered face spoke of decades under the desert sun. "But what burden does he carry?" Sarah understood none of the Apache words, but the tone conveyed suspicion mixed with concern. She pressed the cross harder against her palm, drawing strength from its familiar edges as dozens of dark eyes examined her with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. Running Bear dismounted and lifted Sarah down gently, keeping one protective hand on her shoulder as he faced the gathering crowd. He spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing toward the child while maintaining a tone that Sarah recognized as respectful but firm. The conversation grew heated quickly. An older warrior, with gray streaks in his long hair, stepped forward, his voice rising as he pointed at Sarah. Other voices joined the argument, creating a cacophony of unfamiliar sounds that made Sarah's heart race with renewed fear. "What are they saying?" Sarah whispered, tugging at Running Bear's shirt. "They worried?" he replied quietly. "White child bring white soldiers. Bring war." Sarah looked around the camp with new understanding. These people weren't the savage monsters of frontier stories. They were families trying to survive in an increasingly dangerous world, and her presence threatened their safety just as Morrison's gang had threatened hers. A distinguished Apache man with eagle feathers in his hair emerged from the largest wickiup, and the argument ceased immediately. His presence commanded respect from every person in the camp, marking him clearly as their leader. His eyes found Sarah's, studying her with an intensity that made her want to hide behind Running Bear's protective bulk. Chief Standing Wolf spoke a single word in Apache, and Running Bear's shoulders sagged slightly. Sarah didn't need translation to understand that their reception was not entirely welcome. "Chiefs say you stay tonight," Running Bear explained. "Tomorrow, council decide." Sarah nodded, though her stomach twisted with anxiety about what the council might decide. She had nowhere else to go, no family to claim her, no safe place in a world that seemed determined to treat her as property rather than a person. A young Apache woman approached with hesitant steps, her eyes kind despite obvious uncertainty. She spoke softly to Running Bear, gesturing toward Sarah and then toward her own wickiup. The exchange seemed friendlier than the earlier confrontation, offering a glimmer of hope. "Singing bird, help you wash, find clean clothes," Running Bear translated. "You safe with her?" Sarah hesitated, unwilling to leave the protection of the only person who had shown her kindness. But Running Bear's encouraging nod and Singing Bird's gentle smile convinced her to take the first tentative step toward trust. As Singing Bird led her toward the wickiup, Sarah kept the cross hidden in her palm while observing Apache daily life with fascination. Children played games that looked familiar, despite cultural differences. Mothers tended cooking fires much like her own mother had, and the overall atmosphere spoke of community and family bonds that transcended tribal identity. The wooden cross seemed to grow warmer in her hand, as if her father's God approved of finding kindness among strangers. Perhaps divine protection came in forms that frontier prejudices couldn't recognize, wearing Apache faces and speaking foreign tongues while serving the same purposes as Christian charity. Running Bear watched Sarah disappear into Singing Bird's care, knowing that tonight's council meeting would determine whether his rescue mission became a death sentence for everyone he cared about. The child's cross might represent her people's faith, but it would take Apache wisdom to navigate the dangerous waters ahead. Chief Standing Wolf gripped his ceremonial staff with white knuckles as the tribal council convened beneath the star-studded desert sky. The ancient weapon had been carved from oak, struck by lightning during his grandfather's youth, its surface polished smooth by generations of leaders who had faced impossible decisions. Tonight, the staff's weight seemed heavier than usual, burdened by the knowledge that whatever choice he made would echo through his people's future. The council fire cast dancing shadows across the faces of 12 Apache elders, each man bearing scars from decades of warfare against Mexican soldiers, American cavalry, and rival tribes. They had survived the worst that the frontier could offer, but the frightened white child sleeping in Singing Bird's wickiup presented challenges that violence could not resolve. "Running Bear brings death to our doorstep," declared Greyhawk, the oldest warrior present. His left arm hung useless from a cavalry saber wound received during the Battle of Apache Pass, but his voice still carried the authority of someone who had counted coup on numerous enemies. "White soldiers will follow this child like wolves following blood scent." Running Bear sat cross-legged before the council, maintaining the respectful silence required until given permission to speak. He had expected opposition from the traditional faction, led by warriors who remembered when Apache bands could strike Mexican settlements with impunity. Those days were gone, but some men refused to acknowledge how completely their world had changed. "The child is innocent," Running Bear said, when Chief Standing Wolf finally nodded for him to defend his actions. "Her blood cries for justice. Her parents' spirits demand protection for the one they could not save. Her parents were white settlers," spat Broken Arrow, a middle-aged warrior whose hatred of Americans burned with undiminished intensity. "Their kind murdered my sons at Sand Creek. Their kind drove us from ancestral hunting grounds. Why should Apache warriors risk their lives for enemy children?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the council fire. Several elders nodded agreement, remembering their own losses to American expansion. The massacre at Sand Creek had occurred hundreds of miles away, but news of such atrocities traveled quickly through native communities, reinforcing the conviction that showing mercy to whites only invited greater brutality in return. Chief Standing Wolf studied Running Bear's face, reading determination mixed with desperation. The younger warrior had always walked a difficult path between Apache traditions and white man's world, serving as scout for the cavalry while maintaining loyalty to his people. This rescue attempt might represent his final choice between two irreconcilable loyalties. "Tell us about the men who claimed this child," Standing Wolf commanded, raising the ceremonial staff to silence murmurs of dissent. Running Bear described Morrison's gang in detail, emphasizing their crimes against Mexican and Apache families as well as white settlers. These were not honorable enemies deserving respect, but rabid animals who killed for pleasure rather than survival. "They murdered her parents for gold already spent on whiskey," Running Bear continued. "They wagered her life in a game of cards. These men have no honor, follow no warrior's code. They are butchers who shame even their own people." Young Hawk, barely old enough for council participation, leaned forward with interest. "If we keep the child, we send message that Apache protect innocent ones. Other tribes will see our strength, our justice. Other tribes will see our foolishness," Greyhawk countered. "Cavalry will come in numbers we cannot fight. Our children will die because one warrior could not distinguish between mercy and weakness." The debate continued past midnight, voices rising and falling like coyote songs in the darkness. Some warriors spoke of practical concerns, limited food supplies, exposed mountain positions, the difficulty of defending a camp that included a white child whose presence would justify any military retaliation. Others argued from spiritual perspectives, citing Apache beliefs about protecting those placed under tribal care by the spirits. Chief Standing Wolf listened to every opinion while watching Running Bear's face for signs of doubt or wavering commitment. The rescue had been accomplished through courage and skill, but maintaining protection for Sarah would require sacrifices from the entire community. "What does the child say?" Standing Wolf asked suddenly. "Has she expressed wishes about her fate?" Running Bear translated the question, though he suspected the chief already knew the answer. Sarah had made her preference clear through actions rather than words, accepting Apache hospitality while clinging to Running Bear like a daughter to her father. "She trusts Apache justice more than white man's law," Running Bear replied. "She knows her own people would sell her again if profit warranted." The council fire burned lower as the debate entered its final phase. Chief Standing Wolf felt the ceremonial staff's ancient power flowing through his hands, connecting him to previous leaders who had faced similar impossible choices. Some had chosen war and died gloriously. Others had chosen peace and watched their people fade away on reservations. "We will vote," Standing Wolf announced, raising the staff above his head. "But first, let the child speak for herself. Bring her to the council fire." Running Bear's heart sank as he realized the chief intended to let Sarah's own words determine her fate. An 8-year-old's testimony would carry enormous weight with men who valued honesty above all other virtues. But what could a frightened child say that would convince hardened warriors to risk everything for her protection? The ceremonial staff pointed towards Singing Bird's wickiup like an arrow aimed at the future, its ancient wood trembling slightly in Standing Wolf's weathered hands. Singing Bird's fingers worked methodically with the war paint bowl, grinding red ochre with mountain clay to create the ceremonial colors that would mark her husband for battle. The ancient clay vessel had belonged to her grandmother, used to prepare warriors for raids against Mexican settlements and skirmishes with rival tribes. Tonight, she mixed pigments for what might be the last war her people could afford to fight. The bowl's smooth interior bore stains from decades of use, each layer representing prayers for warriors who might not return home. Red for courage, white for spiritual protection, black for the death that stalked every battlefield. Singing Bird had mixed these colors for her brothers, her father, and now for her husband, who had chosen to stand with Running Bear's dangerous decision. "The council grows more divided," she murmured to the other women gathered in her wickiup. "Half our warriors speak of honor and protection. The other half fear the cavalry will come in numbers like grass after rain." Sarah sat quietly in the corner, watching the preparation ritual with fascination tinged by fear. She didn't understand the Apache words, but the women's expressions conveyed the gravity of their situation. The war paint being mixed might be intended for battles fought because of her presence in the camp. "She brings trouble," whispered Stone Woman, an elder whose husband had died fighting American soldiers 20 years earlier. "White child means white soldiers. Our children will suffer for one warrior's soft heart." Other voices murmured agreement, though not all were convinced. Wind in the trees, a younger woman with infant twins, spoke up with quiet determination. "Child is innocent of her people's crimes. Apache way protects innocent ones, even enemy children." The debate among the women mirrored the council's arguments, but with sharper edges of maternal concern. These mothers knew that their own children would pay the price if Standing Wolf decided to harbor Sarah permanently. Yet Apache traditions demanded protection for those placed under tribal care, regardless of their ancestry. Singing Bird tested the war paint's consistency, adding water drop by drop until the mixture achieved the proper thickness for application. Her husband would wear these colors proudly, but she wondered if he would live long enough to wash them away. Outside, the sound of returning horses announced the arrival of the scouting party Running Bear had sent to monitor the approaches to their hidden valley. 3 warriors dismounted quickly, their faces grim with urgent news that would tip the council's delicate balance toward war or peace. Fast Elk, the youngest of the scouts, burst into the wickiup with barely contained excitement. "Cavalry comes from the south," he announced breathlessly. 2 companies, maybe more. They follow Apache sign through the mountains. Singing Bird's hands stilled on the war paint bowl as the implications sank in. Morrison's gang had apparently convinced military authorities that Apache raiders had kidnapped a white child, triggering the kind of punitive expedition that had destroyed so many native communities. "How long before they reach the valley?" Singing Bird asked, though she dreaded the answer. 2 days, maybe 3, if they stop to rest horses, Fast Elk replied. "But they come with purpose, not patrol. Someone guides them who knows Apache trails." Sarah understood enough of the conversation to recognize her name being spoken repeatedly. The frightened looks directed toward her confirmed what she had feared. Her presence was bringing exactly the kind of trouble the tribal elders had predicted. "I should go," Sarah said quietly, her words carrying clearly in the sudden silence that followed Fast Elk's report. "If soldiers come for me, I should go meet them. Then Apache people be safe." Singing Bird translated the child's offer, watching as expressions around the wickiup shifted from hostility to grudging respect. Even Stone Woman, the most vocal opponent of harboring Sarah, seemed moved by the girl's willingness to sacrifice herself for their protection. "Child has courage," Wind in the trees observed. "She thinks like Apache, puts tribe before self." The war paint bowl seemed to pulse with ancient power as Singing Bird considered the choice before them. They could surrender Sarah to the approaching cavalry, probably saving their own people from military retaliation. Or they could stand by Running Bear's decision, knowing that war would follow as surely as summer followed spring. "Council must decide quickly," Fast Elk urged. "Warriors need time to prepare positions if we choose to fight." Singing Bird lifted the war paint bowl, studying the mixed colors that would soon adorn her husband's face. The red ochre represented blood that would be spilled. White clay symbolized the spirits they would join, and black pigment marked the death that waited for those who chose honor over safety. Through the wickiup's entrance, she could see warriors gathering around the council fire, their faces reflecting the same terrible certainty that filled her heart. The approaching cavalry had forced a decision that could no longer be delayed through debate and discussion. Sarah clutched her father's cross while watching preparations for what might become the battle that destroyed the only people who had shown her kindness since her parents' murder. The irony wasn't lost on her. Trying to save her life might cost the lives of those who had risked everything to protect her. The war paint bowl held colors that would transform peaceful men into instruments of war, but it couldn't change the fact that some choices led only to tragedy, regardless of how honorably they were made. Captain Robert Hayes lifted the cavalry bugle to his lips, its brass surface reflecting the morning sun as he prepared to signal the advance of 2 full companies through the narrow mountain pass. The instrument had sounded charges against Confederate cavalry, Mexican bandits, and hostile tribes across 3 territories. But today's mission carried personal weight that made his hands tremble slightly against the familiar metal. The bugle had belonged to his younger brother Thomas, killed by Apache raiders during a supply train ambush 2 years earlier. Robert had recovered the instrument from his brother's body, along with a promise to their dying mother that he would bring justice to those responsible. Now, following reports of a kidnapped white child, he had the perfect justification for the kind of punitive expedition that would honor Thomas's memory. "Sir, the scouts report fresh sign ahead," Sergeant Mills called from his position near the column's front. "Apache tracks, maybe 12 hours old, heading deeper into the mountains." Hayes nodded grimly, though he wondered privately whether they were pursuing kidnappers or rescuers. The reports from Morrison's gang had been inconsistent, painting the Apache warrior as both savage captor and unlikely protector. But military policy didn't require understanding motivations, only results. Behind the cavalry column, Jake Morrison rode with barely contained fury, his bloodshot eyes scanning every ridge and canyon for signs of the Apache who had humiliated him. The outlaw had convinced the military that Sarah represented a valuable hostage, though his real motivation was revenge against the warrior who had made him look weak in front of his own men. "That Apache's got to be heading for the main camp," Morrison told Captain Hayes during their brief rest stop. "These mountain Indians always run to their people when pressed hard." Hayes studied the crude map Morrison had provided, noting discrepancies between the marked locations and his own intelligence reports about Apache strongholds. The outlaw's information might be outdated or deliberately misleading, but it was the only guide they possessed through terrain that favored defenders over pursuers. "How well do you know this warrior we're tracking?" Hayes asked, though he suspected Morrison's knowledge was limited to brief glimpses during the rescue. "Well enough," Morrison lied smoothly. "He's one of those reservation jumpers who scouts for cavalry when it suits him, then turns hostile when he thinks he can get away with it." The characterization matched Hayes's preconceptions about native scouts, men who served American interests while maintaining suspicious loyalties to their own people. If the Apache truly was a former military scout, he would possess dangerous knowledge about cavalry tactics and capabilities. Meanwhile, 20 miles ahead of the pursuing column, Running Bear studied his own people's defensive preparations with growing concern. The hidden valley provided natural advantages, with narrow approaches that could be defended by small numbers of warriors. But 2 companies of cavalry represented firepower that Apache weapons could not match in prolonged engagement. Young warriors painted their faces with the colors Singing Bird and the other women had prepared, transforming themselves into the images of death that would haunt white settlers' nightmares. But Running Bear understood that courage alone could not overcome the technological advantages that repeating rifles and artillery pieces provided. "We cannot win through direct battle," he told Chief Standing Wolf as they surveyed the valley's defensive positions. "But we might survive long enough to negotiate." Standing, Wolf gripped his ceremonial staff with hands that had grown steadier as the moment of decision approached. Leadership required clarity when faced with impossible choices, and the approaching bugle calls were forcing final commitment to a course of action. "What does the child say?" Standing Wolf asked, though he had already made his decision based on Apache principles rather than practical considerations. Sarah had spent the morning helping Apache women prepare for siege, carrying water and ammunition with the same determination she had once shown helping her mother with household chores. Her willingness to work despite understanding the danger had impressed even the warriors who initially opposed her presence. "She says Apache people her people now," Running Bear replied. "She choose to stay, even knowing cost." The distant sound of Captain Hayes's bugle echoed off canyon walls as the cavalry column resumed its advance. The brass instruments' military precision contrasting sharply with the organic rhythms of Apache preparation. The two forces were converging toward a confrontation that neither truly wanted, but both felt compelled to fight. Hayes polished his brother's bugle while riding, remembering Thomas's enthusiasm for military service and his naive belief that right and wrong could be distinguished clearly on the battlefield. Today's mission would test whether justice could be achieved through violence or whether some conflicts only created more tragedy for everyone involved. The brass instrument would sound again before sunset, calling men to battle for reasons they barely understood, in service of causes that might not justify the blood that would be spilled. The hand-woven blanket felt warm against Sarah's shoulders as Singing Bird wrapped it carefully around the child's trembling frame. The intricate pattern told stories in thread and color, geometric designs representing mountain peaks where eagles nested, flowing lines that symbolized rivers carrying life through desert valleys, and small figures depicting the animals that shared Apache territory. Each thread had been spun by hand, each color derived from plants and minerals gathered in sacred places. "This blanket protect you," Singing Bird said in halting English, her fingers smoothing the fabric with maternal care. "My grandmother weave it for first daughter never born. Now it find purpose with you." Sarah traced the beautiful patterns with wondering fingertips, recognizing the gift's significance even without understanding its complete cultural meaning. The blanket represented acceptance from women who had initially viewed her presence as a threat to their family's safety. Now facing approaching cavalry, they offered protection instead of rejection. Other Apache women gathered around, each bringing small gifts that transformed Sarah from outsider to adopted daughter. Wind in the Trees presented a pair of soft moccasins decorated with turquoise beads. Stone Woman, despite her earlier opposition, offered a small leather pouch filled with pine nuts and dried berries for the hard journey ahead. "Why you help me?" Sarah asked Singing Bird, her voice small with confusion and gratitude. "You brave like Apache child," Singing Bird replied, gesturing toward the valley where warriors prepared defensive positions. "You stay when could run. You work when could hide. Heart more important than skin color." The transformation in tribal attitudes had occurred gradually over the past few days as Sarah proved her willingness to contribute rather than simply consume resources. She had helped tend cooking fires, carried water from the spring, and even assisted with preparing ammunition for the weapons that might soon defend her life. Running Bear approached as the women completed their gift-giving ceremony, his face painted for war, but his eyes soft with affection, as he watched Sarah adjust to her new identity as an Apache daughter. The sight of the child wrapped in traditional blanket, wearing moccasins instead of settler shoes, struck him with unexpected emotion. "You ready for what comes next?" he asked gently, though he knew no child could truly be ready for warfare. Sarah nodded with determination that reminded him of his own son's courage during their final moments together. The comparison was both comforting and heartbreaking, suggesting that some qualities transcended cultural boundaries while highlighting everything he had lost to white man's violence. "I know how to shoot," Sarah said quietly, remembering lessons her father had provided for hunting rabbits and protecting their farm from predators. "If soldiers come, I help fight." Running Bear smiled at her fierce declaration while feeling his heart break at the necessity that drove it. No child should offer to kill in defense of the adults meant to protect her, but frontier life had already taught Sarah harsh lessons about survival and loyalty. "You help best by staying alive," he replied. "Apache way, children protected so they grow strong, carry on tribal memory." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation as scouts returned from monitoring the cavalry's advance. Fast Elk dismounted with urgent news that would determine whether the gifts and preparations had been made in vain. "Soldiers stop early, make camp in the big meadow," he reported breathlessly. "They wait for something. Maybe more troops, or better intelligence about our position." Chief Standing Wolf emerged from the council lodge, his ceremonial staff, marking his authority as he gathered information from returning scouts. The cavalry's hesitation might provide opportunities for negotiation, though Standing Wolf doubted that Morrison's thirst for revenge would permit peaceful resolution. "How many soldiers?" Standing Wolf asked. "Maybe 80, with Indian scouts and civilian guides," Fast Elk replied. "They have wagon with cannon, supplies for long campaign." The numbers were sobering. Apache warriors could fight with courage and skill, but artillery would make their defensive positions untenable if the cavalry chose direct assault over negotiation. Sarah listened to the discussion while clutching the blanket Singing Bird had given her, understanding enough to recognize that her adopted family faced overwhelming odds. The moccasins on her feet felt strange, but somehow appropriate, marking her transformation from white settler's daughter to Apache child. Running Bear knelt beside her, his war paint making him look fearsome to outsider eyes, but reassuring to Sarah, who had learned to read the kindness beneath his warrior's facade. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you remember Apache people love you like daughter," he said solemnly. "You carry our stories, our ways, our memory of this time when different peoples became family." Sarah nodded, though she hoped desperately that remembering wouldn't be necessary. The blanket around her shoulders represented new belonging, but she wanted to live long enough to earn it through more than just surviving catastrophe. The approaching night would be their last before confrontation, and the hand-woven patterns that decorated her gift seemed to shimmer with protective power in the firelight, as if the spirits of Apache grandmothers were wrapping her in their eternal embrace. Captain Hayes spread the detailed military map across his field table as dawn broke over the cavalry encampment. The crisp parchment marked with red lines that traced the systematic encirclement of Apache territory. The map had been drawn by military cartographers based on years of campaign experience, showing elevation contours, water sources, and approach routes with the precision that only professional soldiers could achieve. Each red line represented a company of cavalry positioned to prevent Apache escape, transforming the mountain valley from sanctuary into trap. Hayes had learned tactical patience during his years fighting Confederate raiders, understanding that overwhelming force applied correctly could achieve victory without the massive casualties that direct assault usually required. "Sir, the western approach is secured," reported Lieutenant Morrison, no relation to the outlaw Jake despite sharing the surname. "Captain Williams has his men positioned to intercept any attempt to break through the high passes." Hayes nodded, noting the completion of another section of the encirclement on his map. The Apache were formidable fighters on terrain they knew intimately, but military science eventually overcame even the most skilled irregular forces when properly applied. The strategy reflected lessons learned from successful campaigns against other hostile tribes: isolate the enemy, control their movement options, then force surrender through the threat of overwhelming retaliation rather than actual combat. Glean victories that minimized American casualties while demonstrating federal authority over territorial disputes. "What about the eastern canyons?" Hayes asked, studying the map's elevation markers. "Sergeant Rodriguez reports those passages are too narrow for horse traffic," Lieutenant Morrison replied. "Any Apache trying to escape that direction would have to proceed on foot, leaving them vulnerable to pursuit." The systematic elimination of escape routes satisfied Hayes's professional instincts while troubling his personal conscience. He had joined the military to fight honorable enemies in open battle, not to trap women and children in siege situations that could only end in tragedy. But military orders were clear: recover the kidnapped white child and demonstrate that attacks on American civilians would bring swift and decisive retaliation. The Apache warrior who had taken Sarah Mitchell might have acted from misguided compassion, but his actions had triggered consequences that extended far beyond personal motivation. Meanwhile, within the gradually tightening noose, Chief Standing Wolf studied his own crude map, drawn in the dirt with a pointed stick. The defensive positions showed clearly enough: narrow approaches that could be defended by small numbers of warriors, elevated positions that provided good fields of fire, and fallback positions deeper in the valley for final resistance. But the map also revealed their hopeless strategic situation. The cavalry had enough men to surround the valley completely while maintaining reserve forces for direct assault. Apache weapons could inflict casualties, but not enough to break a professional siege conducted with military patience. Running Bear, your military experience, what would you do in their position? Standing Wolf asked, though he suspected the answer would confirm their worst fears. I would wait, Running Bear replied grimly. Cut off food supplies, control water sources, let hunger do work that bullets cannot. For surrender without battle. The strategy made cold sense from military perspective, but it ignored Apache cultural values that preferred death to capitulation. Warriors who had never surrendered in decades of warfare would not begin now, regardless of practical considerations. Sarah sat nearby, wrapped in her gifted blanket, and listening to discussions she understood better than the adults realized. Her weeks among the Apache had taught her more of their language than anyone suspected, and she grasped the military situation with frightening clarity. What if I go to them? She asked quietly, her words cutting through the strategic planning like a knife. Tell soldiers truth about what happened. Running Bear translated her suggestion, watching as the council considered possibilities they had previously dismissed. A white child's testimony might carry weight with military officers, especially if she could explain the circumstances of her rescue. Soldiers might not believe Apache stole nothing, Standing Wolf mused. Child's words could change their understanding, but the plan carried enormous risks. Once Sarah left Apache protection, she would be completely vulnerable to Morrison's revenge and military justice that might ignore her wishes about where she belonged. I'm not afraid, Sarah declared, though her trembling hands suggested otherwise. Apache people my family now. I tell soldiers true story. Maybe they understand. The military map that Hayes studied showed tactical advantages and strategic positioning, but it couldn't reveal the human bonds that had formed between unlikely allies. Sarah's willingness to risk everything for her adopted people represented factors that military science rarely calculated in planning siege operations. Standing Wolf looked from his dirt map to the child who had become the center of an approaching war, recognizing that sometimes the smallest pieces on the battlefield held the power to change everything. The broken arrow lay in Chief Standing Wolf's weathered palm, its shaft snapped cleanly in half to symbolize the traditional Apache declaration that peace negotiations had failed. The ancient ritual had been performed before countless battles, marking the moment when diplomatic solutions gave way to inevitable warfare. Today, the broken wood represented more than failed negotiations. It embodied the fractures running through the heart of Apache unity. Half our warriors say fight to death rather than surrender the child, Standing Wolf announced to the emergency council gathering at dawn. Other half say her life not worth destruction of entire tribe. The division had deepened throughout the night as reports arrived of additional cavalry units moving into position around their valley stronghold. What had begun as moral disagreement about harboring Sarah had evolved into fundamental conflict about Apache survival in a changing world. Greyhawk, the eldest warrior present, spoke with the authority of someone who had fought Mexican soldiers before American cavalry had ever crossed the Rio Grande. This child represents everything wrong with Running Bear's thinking. He serves white masters as scout, learns their ways, forgets Apache wisdom about keeping separate from enemy peoples. Broken Arrow nodded fierce agreement. Apache who lies with dogs rises with fleas. Running Bear brings white man's war to our doorstep because he cannot see past his own soft heart. But younger warriors had been influenced by Sarah's courage during preparation for siege. Her willingness to work alongside Apache women, despite understanding the danger her presence created. Fast Elk stood to defend Running Bear's decision with passion that surprised the elders. Child shows more honor than many grown warriors, Fast Elk declared. She could have run when soldiers came close. Instead, she stays to face whatever comes with her adopted people. That is Apache way, loyalty to those who protect you. The generational divide was becoming clearer as debate continued. Older warriors remembered when Apache bands could strike enemies and melt away into mountain strongholds, making military pursuit too costly to sustain. Those tactics were no longer viable against systematic campaigns conducted with overwhelming force and unlimited resources. Running Bear sat silent through most of the arguments, understanding that his own words carried little weight with men who questioned his fundamental loyalty to Apache interests. His years of scouting for cavalry had provided useful intelligence about white military capabilities, but they had also marked him as potentially compromised in the eyes of traditional warriors. Sarah herself remained with the women and children, wrapped in her gifted blanket and helping prepare what might be their final meal together. She had learned enough Apache to understand the arguments about her fate, recognizing that her presence was tearing apart the unity that these people needed for survival. "I should go," she whispered to Singing Bird. "They fight because of me. If I leave, maybe fighting stops." Singing Bird translated the child's words to the council, watching as expressions shifted from anger to something approaching shame. Even the most militant warriors seemed affected by Sarah's willingness to sacrifice herself for their protection. Chief Standing Wolf held the broken arrow up to catch morning light, studying the clean break that had been made with ceremonial precision. The symbol represented more than failed diplomacy. It embodied the choice between honor and survival that Apache leaders had faced for generations. "Running Bear," Standing Wolf called, his voice cutting through the heated arguments. "You brought this child to us. You must speak for your decision before final judgment." Running Bear stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the council focused on his face. These men had been his brothers in warfare, his companions in the desperate struggle to preserve Apache independence. Now they would judge whether his compassion had doomed them all. "I saved one innocent life," Running Bear said simply. "Apache way protects those who cannot protect themselves. Child's skin color matters less than her courage, her loyalty, her willingness to share our fate." "Pretty words," Greyhawk spat. "But cavalry bullets make no distinction between Apache warriors and their white pets. We all die because you could not let White Child face white justice." The broken arrow seemed to pulse with ancient power in Standing Wolf's grip, connecting him to previous leaders who had made equally impossible decisions. Some had chosen resistance and died fighting. Others had chosen accommodation and watched their people fade away on reservations. "Vote will be taken," Standing Wolf announced, raising the broken arrow above his head. "Those who say fight for child's freedom, stand on my right. Those who say surrender child to save tribe, stand on my left." The council members moved slowly, each man choosing a side that would determine not only Sarah's fate, but the future of their community. The broken arrow would remain broken regardless of their decision, but their unity might still be preserved if wisdom could overcome the divisions that threatened to destroy them from within. Running Bear watched the warriors divide themselves according to conscience and calculation, understanding that some fractures could never be repaired once they had been acknowledged and made visible. Sarah's small fingers traced both sides of the medallion Running Bear had given her the night before, one face bearing a rough Christian cross carved into silver, the other displaying Apache symbols representing protection and strength. The dual-sided piece had belonged to his wife Morning Star, who had worn it as a bridge between the Catholic faith imposed by Spanish missionaries and the ancient Apache beliefs that sustained her people through centuries of struggle. Morning Star believed spirits work through many paths, Running Bear had explained as he placed the medallion around Sarah's neck. Cross and eagle feather both carry prayers to same sky. You choose which prayer fits your heart. Now, standing before the assembled tribal council as dawn painted the canyon walls gold, Sarah felt the medallion's weight against her chest like a physical manifestation of the impossible choice she faced. The Apache warriors had divided themselves according to their beliefs about her worth versus their tribe's survival, and Chief Standing Wolf had decided to let her own words determine the final outcome. "Speak, child," Standing Wolf commanded gently. "Tell Apache Council what heart says about staying or going." Sarah looked around the circle of painted faces, seeing men who had become fathers, brothers, and protectors during the brief weeks of her residence among them. Some watched her with obvious affection, while others maintained careful neutrality that couldn't quite hide their hope that she would choose departure over destruction. "I understand Apache language more than you think," Sarah began, her words causing surprised murmurs among warriors who had debated her fate, assuming she couldn't follow their discussions. "I know soldiers come because of me. I know some warriors think my presence brings danger to innocent people." The medallion seemed to grow warm against her skin as she struggled to find words that could bridge the gap between what her heart wanted and what wisdom demanded. The Apache way valued courage, but it also emphasized responsibility to the larger community over individual desires. "My first family died because bad men wanted gold," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she found her message. "These same bad men trade me like horse or cow, not caring if I live or die. But Apache people see Sarah as person, as daughter, as sister. You give me family when I have nothing." Chief Standing Wolf leaned forward slightly, recognizing the formal speaking patterns that Apache children learned for addressing tribal councils. Someone had been teaching Sarah more than basic survival skills during her time with them. "Running Bear saved my life, but all Apache people save my spirit," Sarah said, touching the medallion's cross side briefly before shifting to the Apache symbols. "Now Sarah must choose. Stay with people who love her and maybe cause their death, or go to people who see her as property, but maybe keep Apache families safe." The directness of her presentation stunned several warriors who had expected childish pleading or emotional manipulation. Instead, Sarah was demonstrating the kind of mature reasoning that Apache culture valued in adults, weighing competing loyalties with clear understanding of consequences. "What does Sarah's heart say?" asked Fast Elk, the young warrior who had become one of her strongest defenders. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the medallion's dual symbols pressing against her palm as she sought guidance from whatever spirits watched over lost children caught between worlds. When she opened them again, her gaze was steady and determined. "Sarah choose to go to soldiers," she announced, her words hitting the council like physical blows. "But not because Apache people bad or because white people better. Sarah go because love means protecting people you love, even when protection hurts your own heart." The silence that followed her declaration stretched long enough for everyone to absorb the implications of her decision. She was choosing sacrifice over safety, community welfare over personal happiness, in a display of moral courage that shamed some of the warriors who had questioned her worth. "Sarah, ask one thing," she continued, reaching behind her neck to unclasp the medallion. "When soldiers come, Running Bear tell them true story about Morrison's gang, about poker game, about murder of Sarah's first family. Maybe truth changed their thinking about who is criminal and who is hero." She held the medallion out to Running Bear, though her hands trembled with the effort of letting go of the symbol that represented her new identity as an Apache daughter. "You keep this for Sarah," she said. "Someday, when world different, maybe Sarah come back to Apache people who saved her spirit, even if they cannot keep her body." The medallion caught morning light as it passed from her small hands to Running Bear's weathered palms, its dual symbols representing the cultural complexity that had shaped her impossible choice. She was 8 years old, but the decision she had made carried the weight of wisdom that some adults never achieved. Chief Standing Wolf gripped the ceremonial war lance with hands that no longer trembled, the ancient weapon's eagle feathers stirring in the canyon wind as he made his final decision. The lance had been carried by Apache war leaders for 7 generations, its iron point forged from meteorite metal that had fallen from the sky during his great-grandfather's youth. Today, it would either lead his people to glorious death or witness their final stand for honor against impossible odds. Sarah Mitchell has chosen to sacrifice herself for Apache survival. Standing Wolf announced to the gathered warriors, his voice carrying the authority that had guided his people through 2 decades of warfare. But Apache warriors do not hide behind children, even brave children who offer their lives for our protection. The decision surprised no one who truly knew their chief. Standing Wolf had spent years walking the narrow path between resistance and accommodation, seeking ways to preserve Apache independence without triggering the massive retaliation that had destroyed other tribes. But some lines could not be crossed without losing everything that made survival worthwhile. "We fight," Standing Wolf declared, raising the war lance toward the sky where eagles circled on rising thermals. "Not because we can win, but because some things matter more than victory. Our children will remember that Apache warriors died protecting innocence rather than trading it for temporary safety." The response was immediate and unanimous. Warriors, who had been divided minutes earlier by debates about Sarah's fate, now united behind their chief's moral clarity. Greyhawk, despite his advanced age and previous opposition, stepped forward to accept war paint from Singing Bird's hands. "Better to die as Apache warriors than live as reservation prisoners," Greyhawk declared, allowing the ceremonial colors to transform his weathered features into a mask of spiritual power. "Our spirits will join the ancestors with honor intact." Sarah watched the transformation from frightened men arguing about survival into warriors preparing for sacred battle. She didn't fully understand the cultural forces driving their decision, but she recognized courage when she saw it. These people were choosing death over dishonor, just as her father had done when Morrison's gang attacked their homestead. "Why they no let me go?" Sarah asked Running Bear as he adjusted his own war paint with practiced precision. "I make choice to save them. Apache way not same as white way," Running Bear explained patiently. "White people maybe trade children for safety, but Apache warriors protect weak ones even unto death. Is what separates humans from animals protecting those who cannot protect themselves." The war lance seemed to pulse with ancient power as Standing Wolf used it to draw defensive positions in the sandy canyon floor. The plan was simple because complexity would fail under pressure: hold the narrow approaches as long as possible, then fall back to prepared positions deeper in the valley. Young warriors took positions on the high rocks, armed with rifles taken from previous encounters with cavalry patrols. They would have perhaps 20 rounds each, enough for one serious engagement before reverting to traditional weapons that had served Apache fighters for centuries. "Sarah, you stay with women and children in deepest cave," Standing Wolf instructed. "If warriors fail, maybe you survive to carry Apache memory to future generations." Sarah shook her head with determination that reminded everyone present of her remarkable courage. "I stay with warriors. If Apache people fight for Sarah, then Sarah fight with Apache people." Her declaration drew smiles from men preparing for death, recognizing the spirit that had made her worthy of their protection. Running Bear handed her a small rifle that had belonged to his son, teaching her quickly how to load and aim the weapon she might need before the day ended. The ceremonial war lance caught sunlight as Standing Wolf planted it firmly in the canyon's center, marking the spot where Apache resistance would make its final stand. The eagle feathers attached to its shaft fluttered like prayers carried on desert wind, connecting earthbound warriors to the spirits who watched over all battles fought for righteous causes. "When cavalry comes, they find Apache warriors ready to die with honor," Standing Wolf announced. "Let them remember that some people cannot be broken by threats, cannot be bought with promises, cannot be frightened into abandoning what they hold sacred." Sarah clutched the small rifle while watching her adopted family prepare for sacrifice on her behalf, understanding finally why Running Bear had risked everything to save her from Morrison's gang. These people didn't see her as property or burden, but as daughter worth any price to protect. The war lance stood like a beacon against the canyon wall, its ancient power calling Apache warriors to their destiny, while eagles circled overhead in acknowledgement of the courage about to be displayed below. Fast Elk held the polished smoke signal mirror toward the morning sun, adjusting its angle until the reflected light flashed across the canyon in the precise pattern that would coordinate Apache defensive positions. The mirror had been captured during a raid on a Mexican army supply train 5 years earlier, its surface scratched but still capable of sending messages across distances that voices could not reach. The signaling system allowed warriors scattered throughout the canyon's defensive positions to coordinate their actions without revealing their locations to the approaching cavalry. 3 flashes meant enemy spotted. 5 flashes indicated cavalry in position for attack. 7 flashes would signal the final retreat to prepared positions in the canyon's deepest recesses. Soldiers moving into position at canyon mouth. Fast Elk reported to Chief Standing Wolf, reading return signals from sentries posted on the high ridges. Maybe 60 men, with pack animals carrying supplies for siege. Standing Wolf nodded grimly, understanding that Captain Hayes had chosen professional tactics over hasty assault. The cavalry would establish strong positions at the canyon's entrance, then use superior firepower to systematically reduce Apache defensive positions without risking unnecessary casualties among his own men. The strategy was militarily sound, but time-consuming, which might provide opportunities for negotiation if Apache leaders could demonstrate their willingness to fight while avoiding complete destruction of both forces. Send signal for parley, Standing Wolf decided. Maybe cavalry commander listen to reason when he understand true situation. Fast Elk adjusted the mirror's angle, sending the traditional Apache request for negotiation in flashing patterns that any experienced frontier soldier would recognize. The response came quickly, 5 long flashes followed by steady reflection, indicating willingness to talk under flag of truce. Running Bear prepared to serve as translator, understanding both languages and cultures well enough to bridge gaps that pure translation could not address. His years of scouting for cavalry had taught him how military officers thought, what arguments might influence their decisions. "What message do we send?" Running Bear asked Standing Wolf as they prepared for what might be their last attempt at peaceful resolution. "Truth," Standing Wolf replied simply. "Child rescued from criminals, not kidnapped from family. Apache warriors protect innocent one from men who would treat her like property." Meanwhile, Captain Hayes studied his own signaling equipment as he prepared to meet with Apache representatives under the traditional white flag. His military training emphasized achieving objectives with minimum casualties, but his personal feelings about his brother's death complicated his professional judgment. The smoke signal mirror caught sunlight again as Fast Elk coordinated the final defensive preparations with scattered Apache positions. Warriors acknowledged their readiness with return signals, confirming that rifles were loaded, traditional weapons prepared, and fallback positions secured for the prolonged battle that seemed increasingly inevitable. Sarah watched the mirror's flashing communications while helping Apache women prepare bandages and gather medical supplies for treating wounded warriors. She had learned enough of their signaling system to understand that messages were being exchanged with the approaching soldiers, raising hope that bloodshed might still be avoided. "Maybe soldiers understand truth when Running Bear explain everything," Sarah said to Singing Bird, though her voice carried more hope than conviction. "Maybe," Singing Bird agreed, though her hands continued preparing supplies for treating battle wounds. "But soldiers follow orders, not always truth." The mirror flashed again as sentries reported cavalry movements at the canyon's entrance. Hayes was positioning his men with the patience of someone who understood that siege warfare required systematic preparation rather than dramatic gestures. "Time for parley," Standing Wolf announced, taking up his ceremonial staff while gesturing for Running Bear to accompany him toward the designated meeting place. Fast Elk maintained his position with the signal mirror, ready to coordinate Apache responses to whatever developments emerged from the negotiation. The polished surface reflected not only sunlight, but also the hopes of an entire community that truth might prove stronger than prejudice. The mirror had served Apache warriors in dozens of previous battles, coordinating raids and defensive actions with the efficiency that made their forces formidable despite numerical disadvantages. Today, it would either signal successful negotiation or the beginning of what might be their final battle as an independent people. Sarah clutched her small rifle while watching Running Bear and Standing Wolf walk toward their meeting with Captain Hayes. Understanding that the flashing mirror signals had set in motion events that would determine whether her sacrifice had been necessary or whether another solution might still be possible. The ancient communication system reflected more than light. It carried the prayers and hopes of people who had spent generations fighting for the right to live, according to their own values, rather than accepting submission to forces beyond their control. The burning arrow streaked across the canyon like a comet, trailing fire and death, its flame illuminating the moral darkness that had consumed men's souls on both sides of the conflict. Running Bear had dipped the arrowhead in pine pitch and set it ablaze before drawing his bowstring, creating a weapon that would serve as beacon and destroyer simultaneously as negotiations collapsed into violence. The parley had lasted less than 10 minutes before Captain Hayes realized that Jake Morrison's version of events bore little resemblance to the truth Running Bear presented. But military orders were clear: recover the white child and demonstrate federal authority over territorial disputes. Personal doubts about mission objectives couldn't override official directives, especially with Morrison demanding immediate action. "Return the girl, and your people won't be harmed," Hayes had said, though his voice lacked conviction even as he spoke the words. "Child chooses Apache family over white captivity," Standing Wolf had replied, with dignity that impressed even hostile observers. "Apache warriors protect children from those who would harm them, regardless of skin color." The burning arrow had been Running Bear's response to Morrison's shouted demand that the negotiations end and the real work begin. The outlaw's bloodlust had finally overcome Hayes's military caution, triggering the violence that both Apache leaders and reasonable cavalry officers had hoped to avoid. Now, as the flaming projectile arced toward the cavalry positions, it carried with it the prayers of Apache warriors and the tears of Apache women who understood that their men were choosing honor over survival. The pitch-soaked cloth wrapped around the arrowhead burned bright enough to be seen for miles, a signal to any watching spirits that the final battle had begun. Sarah crouched behind a boulder with her small rifle, watching Apache warriors take their positions along the canyon's defensive line. The burning arrow had transformed the morning's tense standoff into active warfare, though she still hoped that the fighting might somehow end without destroying everyone she had learned to love. "Stay low, keep head down," Singing Bird instructed as she checked Sarah's rifle to ensure it was properly loaded. "Shoot only if soldiers come close. Aim for center of body, not head or arms." The practical advice came from a woman who had seen too many battles, lost too many husbands and sons to frontier warfare. But her calm demeanor helped steady Sarah's nerves as bullets began whining off canyon walls with increasing frequency. Captain Hayes cursed his brother's memory as he realized Morrison had maneuvered him into exactly the kind of punitive expedition that created more problems than it solved. The burning arrow suggested that Apache warriors were prepared for extended resistance, not the quick surrender that would have justified the military resources committed to this operation. "Sir, should we bring up the cannon?" asked Lieutenant Morrison, eager to demonstrate overwhelming firepower against Apache positions. Hayes hesitated, understanding that artillery would make Apache resistance impossible to maintain, but would also ensure that no one survived to provide testimony about what had actually occurred in this remote canyon. Dead witnesses couldn't contradict official reports about savage kidnappers and heroic rescue missions. The burning arrow finally struck the ground near the cavalry's pack animals, spooking horses and scattering supplies while failing to cause any serious damage. But its symbolic impact was greater than its physical effect, marking the moment when talking ended and killing began. Apache rifles opened fire from concealed positions, their shots carefully aimed to conserve ammunition while demonstrating that surrender was not an option. Running Bear's military experience showed in the defensive plan, overlapping fields of fire, prepared fallback positions, and coordination that made their small numbers more effective than random resistance would have been. Sarah squeezed her rifle's trigger when a blue uniformed figure appeared near her position, feeling the weapon kick against her shoulder while wondering if her shot had found its target. The idea of killing another human being horrified her, but protecting her Apache family seemed to justify actions that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. The burning arrow's fire had spread to dry grass near the cavalry positions, creating smoke that obscured vision and added confusion to an already chaotic situation. Hayes realized that his professional military operation was degenerating into the kind of wilderness skirmish that produced casualties without achieving clear objectives. "Cease fire!" Hayes shouted, hoping to regain control of events that Morrison's bloodlust had set in motion. But the outlaws' gang had already begun advancing toward Apache positions, driven by revenge rather than military discipline. The burning arrow had illuminated more than physical targets. It had revealed the moral complexity of a conflict where right and wrong could not be distinguished by uniform colors or racial identity. Now that fire was spreading beyond anyone's ability to control, consuming everything in its path. Sarah's family Bible emerged from her dress pocket like a divine revelation. Its leather cover scarred by bullets and bloodstains, but its pages intact despite the violence that had surrounded it since her parents' murder. The holy book had survived the massacre at the Mitchell homestead, the poker game in Tombstone's saloon, the desperate flight through desert canyons, and now the battle that threatened to destroy everyone she loved. "Stop!" Sarah screamed above the gunfire, standing up from her protected position despite Singing Bird's frantic attempts to pull her back to safety. "I have proof. I have proof about who killed my family." Her child's voice cut through the chaos like a knife through fabric, causing both Apache warriors and cavalry soldiers to pause their shooting as they tried to understand what the small figure was shouting from the canyon's defensive line. The Bible's pages fluttered in the desert wind as Sarah held it above her head, its familiar weight grounding her courage as she prepared to reveal the truth that could save or damn everyone present. Inside the book's front cover, her father had written the family's history in careful script, names, dates, and locations that documented their journey from Missouri to the Arizona Territory. "My father write everything in Bible," Sarah called toward the cavalry positions, her words carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "He write about Morrison's gang, about threats, about protection money they demand from settlers." Captain Hayes lowered his rifle, struggling to understand how a child's religious book could be relevant to the military action he was conducting. But something in Sarah's desperate certainty made him signal for a temporary ceasefire, while she explained her claims. "What are you talking about, girl?" Hayes shouted back, though Morrison's sudden pallor suggested the outlaw understood exactly what Sarah meant. Sarah opened the Bible to pages where her father had documented the gang's extortion activities, reading aloud from entries that revealed Morrison's systematic terrorizing of frontier families. March 15th. Morrison's men demand $50 for protection from Apache raids. Refused payment. April 2nd. Found cattle killed, probably warning from Morrison gang. April 20th. Morrison himself came to house, threatened Martha and Sarah directly. The final entry, dated 3 days before the family's murder, described Morrison's explicit threat to take what we want if you won't pay what you owe. Her father had hidden the Bible during the attack, hoping it might someday serve as evidence against the men who destroyed his family. Hayes felt his stomach turn as he realized the implications of the child's testimony. If Morrison's gang had murdered her parents for refusing extortion payments, then her rescue by Apache warriors took on completely different meaning. Instead of kidnapping, it had been an act of justice that prevented Morrison from profiting from his own crimes. "She's lying!" Morrison shouted, his desperation making him reckless as he stepped into the open to deny accusations that could lead to his hanging. "That book don't prove nothing. Apache probably killed her parents and made her write those stories." But Sarah's next revelation shattered Morrison's defense completely. "Morrison, you have scar on left hand from knife fight in Tucson. You told Papa about it when you came to collect money. Said knife went between your fingers but missed the bone." Hayes turned to stare at Morrison's left hand, noting the distinctive scar that exactly matched Sarah's description. The detail was too specific for fabrication, too personal for anyone to know without direct contact with the outlaw. "How does she know about your scar, Morrison?" Hayes demanded, his military training helping him recognize truth when confronted with it. The child's testimony was destroying everything Morrison had told him about Apache kidnappers and innocent victims. Running Bear seized the moment to provide additional evidence, speaking in clear English that carried across the canyon. "Morrison's gang also murdered Apache family 2 months ago, steal horses and guns. We tracked them from Burning Village to Sarah's home, find same tracks, same horseshoes." The convergence of evidence was overwhelming. Sarah's Bible documented Morrison's threats, her detailed knowledge proved direct contact with the outlaw, and Apache testimony connected the gang to multiple murders across the territory. Hayes realized with growing horror that he had been manipulated into attacking innocent people who had rescued a child from her parents' murderers. Morrison's lies had triggered a military action that violated every principle of justice the cavalry was supposed to uphold. "Stand down!" Hayes ordered his men, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally understood the true nature of the situation. "All units, cease fire immediately." The Bible's pages rustled in Sarah's small hands as she watched understanding dawn across Captain Hayes's face, recognizing the moment when truth finally overcame deception and prejudice. The Holy Book had served as more than religious comfort. It had become the key that unlocked justice for her murdered parents and her Apache protectors. The sacred peace pipe passed slowly around the circle of former enemies, its carved wooden stem smooth from generations of use in ceremonies that transformed conflict into understanding. Chief Standing Wolf had brought the pipe from his grandfather's medicine bundle, recognizing that some moments required the most powerful symbols of reconciliation that Apache culture could provide. Captain Hayes accepted the pipe with hands that still trembled from the realization of how completely Morrison had deceived him. The tobacco mixture burned with sweet fragrance that seemed to cleanse the air of gunpowder smoke and the bitter taste of near tragedy. Around him, Apache warriors and cavalry soldiers sat together in a peace that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. "This pipe smoked by Apache leaders and American generals before," Standing Wolf explained, as Hayes drew smoke and passed the sacred object to Running Bear. "Same tobacco, same prayers for understanding between peoples who share same land." Sarah sat between Running Bear and Singing Bird, still wearing her Apache blanket, but holding her father's Bible open to pages that had changed everything. The evidence of Morrison's crimes had not only cleared the Apache of wrongdoing, but had also revealed a pattern of violence that extended far beyond her family's murder. Morrison himself sat shackled near the cavalry horses, guarded by soldiers who now understood they had been serving a criminal rather than pursuing justice. His gang members had been arrested after Hayes discovered additional evidence linking them to attacks on Mexican settlements and Apache camps throughout the territory. "What happens now?" Sarah asked Captain Hayes, her question carrying weight that extended beyond immediate concerns about her own fate. Hayes studied the child who had shown more courage and wisdom than most adults he had known, recognizing that her future would be shaped by decisions made in the coming hours. Military regulations provided no guidance for situations where rescued children preferred their rescuers to their own people. "That depends on what you want," Hayes replied honestly. "You could come with us to the territorial capital, maybe find a family to take you in. Or you could stay here, though I'm not sure how that would work legally." Sarah looked around the circle of faces, Apache warriors who had been willing to die for her protection, cavalry officers who had learned uncomfortable truths about their own prejudices, and the woman who had become more of a mother to her than anyone since her own mother's death. "I want to stay Apache," Sarah said simply, "but I also want to help white people understand that Apache are not enemies. Maybe I can be bridge between both peoples." Running Bear smiled at her choice of words, recognizing wisdom that had taken him decades to develop. The child understood instinctively what he had learned through painful experience, that survival in a changing world required building bridges rather than walls between different cultures. "The territorial governor might accept formal adoption," Hayes suggested, his legal training helping him find solutions that military regulations couldn't address, especially if Apache leaders are willing to allow Sarah to serve as translator and cultural intermediary when needed. Chief Standing Wolf drew deeply on the peace pipe before responding, understanding that Sarah's unique position could benefit both Apache and American interests. A child who belonged to both worlds could help prevent the kind of misunderstandings that led to unnecessary warfare. "Sarah is Apache daughter," Standing Wolf declared, "but she also white child who understands white ways. Maybe spirits send her to help two peoples learn to live together instead of fighting." The peace pipe completed its circuit as the sun set. Behind canyon walls that had witnessed near tragedy, transformed into hope for better. Understanding between peoples who shared the same sky. Smoke from the sacred tobacco rose toward stars that watched over all children regardless of the color of their skin. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the territorial capital's courthouse wearing both her Apache blanket and a new dress, purchased for the formal adoption ceremony that would make her legally the daughter of Running Bear and Singing Bird. The Bible that had saved so many lives rested on the judge's desk as evidence of the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. "This is highly unusual," Judge Morrison, no relation to the executed outlaw, admitted as he reviewed the adoption papers. "But the child's testimony about criminal activities and her role in preventing a military disaster certainly qualify as exceptional circumstances," Sarah smiled as she watched Running Bear carefully sign the legal documents that would allow her to remain with the people who had risked everything for her protection. The pen felt strange in his weathered hands, but his signature was firm and clear. The peace pipe had done its work, transforming enemies into allies and creating a family that transcended the racial boundaries that had once seemed impossible to cross. In the end, love had proved stronger than prejudice, and courage had overcome the fear that kept different peoples apart.